We'll take off. All right. Afternoon, mate.
How are you, man?
I'm good. I'm good. Thank you for welcoming me to your lovely home.
Thank you, thank you.
This is
Thanks for allowing me being lazy.
no. This is. I'm happy
Yeah.
to meet you at your convenience. Yeah, this is amazing. I think featured in
A few mags.
a few
It's not
magazines
my
for
work.
its interior design.
Thank you.
Excellent. Anyway, we've known each other for a few years.
No, more than a few years.
More than a few years, a decade at least.
Yeah, a bit more than a decade.
A
Yeah,
bit-
crazy.
How long?
I think like 11 years now.
11 years, yeah, a long time. We're both civil servants at the
Yeah.
moment. So yeah, actually, why don't you introduce yourself and we'll get into a conversation
Cool.
about...
So I'm Junaed. My day job is that I'm the senior advisor for the climate investment funds, and my night job, as I call
In which
it,
department?
in Department for Energy Security Net Zero. So that used to be part of BEIS, so Business Energy Industrial Strategy. And the night job, as I call it, is that I run up the race network in my home department, and I manage the Civil Service Race Forum, which is the umbrella organisation for all the respective race networks in governmental bodies and armament bodies.
So you're a busy man.
Yeah.
How'd you do it all?
Something has to give. Something has to give.
Yeah, well, I suppose it's a passion as well, right?
Yeah.
Because, obviously I've known you for a long, long time, and you've always struck me as someone who's passionate about policy, passionate about inclusion, diversity, and so it's not a surprise to see you in those different things. Obviously, as civil servants, there's only so much we can say about the policy that we're working on actively, but perhaps we can start there and just climate and change and net zero. Maybe just for those who aren't aware of the kind of things your department's looking into, just kind of let us know.
So I could take a step back a bit more. So climate change is obviously a really big global issue which we're facing, which has been known since 1960s and 70s, but really has gained a lot more prominence both in civil society and now through governments and through the private sector. So there's a lot more buy-in now that climate change is something which we have to deal with, and the effects of it are actually being seen now. And what this means for kind of civil servants is that we work through government to implement the policy changes that influences not only what we do domestically at home, but can help others internationally to solve a global issue.
And I imagine that international coordination looks different depending on the country. So for richer countries, is it a particular type of conversation, and for countries who are on the sharp end of the effects of climate change, a different conversation?
It definitely is. So the main thing about climate change is how do we deal with climate change and who's bearing responsibility. And the problem is that historically, so when you got the kind of big negotiations, because to organise internationally, you can't force other countries to act on climate change. You can only have certain rules of understanding. So first you need governments to agree on what needs to happen, set the pathways, and the rest follow suit. And the big discussions has been who bears responsibility and how do we go about dealing with climate change. And there's two main paths. There's mitigation, which is curbing future emissions, and then there's adaptation, which is dealing with the effects of climate change now. And so if you're a developing country, per se, you're more likely to be in an area which is more prone to climate change and have less ability to cope with the changes. So think about the floods in Pakistan. Historically it's been cyclones, etc. in Bangladesh. You've got to think about desertification in the Sahel region, Africa. These countries in these kind of ecosystems face the brunt of climate change now. And so they have different priorities of what we need to focus on when we deal with climate change. And actually what we need to make in the argument is that what we've seen recently is having a unified understanding of where all your strengths lie and how you can work together. So in 2015 we had the Paris Agreement, which is monumental in that previous negotiations focused on just developed countries, as they called it, to act on climate change. And now we have a much more holistic global approach to dealing with climate change. And
when you say holistic, like what does that mean? So it now includes who wasn't there before?
So it now includes what we term as lower income countries. So in the 1990s, you had kind of developing countries divide, and the blame was on developed countries to deal with climate change because they're the ones who cause the most industrial emissions. And
Junaed's cats is on the thing.
On
I
the
just want to check
tablet,
they
right.
haven't shifted the angle.
No, it's fine.
No,
It's
they're
fine.
good.
It's fine. We're good. Yeah. So now they've got every country involved. Yeah.
Sorry, I just want to check one more thing. Sorry. Yeah, it's recording.
Yeah. To make sure. So now that we've got every country involved tackling climate change, you've got more voices on the international fora to say what we can do to meet the challenges. Because previously, when it came to only developed countries, the focus was on mitigation. And now we've got a position where internationally everyone agrees on a temperature goal, which is what the science says we must have to minimize the impacts. So we locked into 1.1, 1.2 degrees average temperature rise compared to the industrial revolution. And we're seeing the effects now in terms of, like, you look outside, January used to be like snowy, now it's not anymore. It's anecdotally speaking, but you can see there's a lot more global extremes in weather, which is happening a lot more often than was the case before. And the international community has agreed between 1.5 and 2 degrees is where we should aim to keep the rise to. So that's the kind of situation with international climate change at the moment.
Yeah, and has the debate shifted now as well from mitigation to compensation? Is there a conversation now about those? Yeah.
So there's two ways how the debate has shifted. So one is mitigation adaptation isn't a binary. There's a new term called climate resilience, which is how do you have a much more systematic way of thinking and integrating a lot more considerations in dealing with climate change. So you can deal with climate change, but it's about the transition too. So there's no point getting rid of coal facilities, which might have been a major employer for many communities, if you don't give them an alternative. Or there's no point in managing the ecological elements without dealing with social elements, such as, for instance, anything to do with the employment status of those who are employed in previous industries, the kind of gender dynamics, so what's going to happen to women in the household, etc., with like a changing labour force, and dealing with other kind of considerations which enable more just transition. That's one element. And the other one is on the arguments which I had before about historical kind of justice or climate reparations, the term often used.
Climate justice,
reparations, loss and damage. These are all terminologies to say that developed countries historically caused emissions in the industrial age, and why is it that we can't develop but you guys are allowed to develop? So that's the kind of traditional UN level conversations, and now shifting more towards recognition that these countries need financing now, and this is how you can help deal with the issues now and build a pathway to the future.
Sure.
Yeah.
Before I get into some of the technical bits of what you've just said as well, just interesting to know how you've come into this space. Was it like, so 12 years ago since we first met each other, to say you'll be going into climate health policy, is that obvious, or was there something that particularly drew you to that?
So it was actually by chance. So I actually did I did politics at A-levels because I realised when I was younger there's more to the world than learning the traditional hard subjects. So I really wanted to open my mind at A-level to study politics. So I went to a sixth form college which offered a really good political course and a really good political teacher who was really enthusiastic. And then I decided to do politics for undergrad and then take it a bit further to a postgrad level and learn more about politics and develop it further. I eventually ended up joining the civil service, and I was actually a direct appointment to the climate change team. So
and you've just not left since?
I've not left the space.
Amazing.
Yeah, so initially,
because traditionally, don't most civil servants move departments, move teams to gain awareness of Whitehall? And
they do. So I was quite lucky that I joined the climate negotiations team, which was seen as sexy because you get to fly around the whole world on like negotiations. It really wasn't.
Yeah.
Like, you spend many hours.
But you make it sexy all on your own.
No. You spend many hours negotiating like bullet points and paragraphs. So I did that
Sounds
for
fun.
3 years, and then I joined climate finance, which is another component within the international climate change offer, which is about managing programs and activities which allow finance to spur kind of changes at project level. So I looked at projects which looked at clean cook stoves in Kenya and another country I forgot, which had not only climate benefits but also health benefits and gender benefits. and then I also went all the way up to now where I'm looking at massive multi. The climate investment fund is like $11.5 billion worth in its entity, and it signs
And that's a mixture of government fund, private funds.
It's all so that's purely the government funds.
Wow.
It co-finances 10 times the amount from other sources.
Wow.
And the average project size, it varies from low 7-digit figures to even 8-digit
Wow.
figures in terms of program size. So it's
It's
quite a
big
broad
money.
range I've seen. Yeah, it's big
And
money.
I mean, countries are putting big bets behind this. The US, for example, like subsidizing an investment in its industries to want to be a green superpower. China equally, and again, going to put this caveat all the time, but we have civil servants, we have to be careful about what we say. But the opposition at the moment talking about nationalising energy companies wanting to be a green superpower. Yeah, what are your thoughts on political parties and administrations really moving towards green energy?
I definitely seen it. So when I was in the climate change space only 5 years ago, any consideration about carbon border adjustment mechanism would have been unthinkable. So now we have that at the EU level. So I think governments are definitely getting a lot more active in the policies they implement at regional and domestic level. I think it's a welcome shift to how it was viewed less than 5 years ago. The only question is, how do you coordinate that and not be seen as a zero-sum game? So, for instance, with the Inflation Reduction Act in the USA, is that in sync with the EU policies to make sure that they're not competing with each other in terms of like what's seen as green subsidies?
Yeah, but whose interest is it that they are in sync? Because for France and Germany, perhaps it may not be in their interest that they're in sync, because some commentators would say actually they need to protect their member states' EU's position, vice versa for the US. Like they want to be the first to be in. So yeah,
exactly.
What do you mean by in sync?
That's a good point. So it needs to be in sync, because what you do with these kind of policies is that you signal to the market that, for instance, with, let's say, carbon border adjustment mechanism, that having dirty assets and means of productions would have much higher costs. So you price an externality. By making sure that policies in sync internationally, is that you can coordinate how you make the pathway to implement those kind of measures. So, for instance, a carbon border adjustment European Union can sound great at its own, but how do you help countries like India or China to have a lot more cleaner, more efficient ways of producing steel and so forth, which can then allow them to export those products in the EU and vice versa.
Yeah.
And that's when the role of, like, by coordinating, you say, listen, this is what we want as a target, and these are the kind of boundaries we put on what we think is unacceptable, and this is how, like, what we used to call international, overseas aid, now is called development assistance. It can help you to learn the technical know-how and also finance the actual capital financing to decarbonize and do so in a kind of really, really effective and just way.
Yeah. Super interesting, but one last question I might ask on this before you kind of move on is, how does the geopolitics of the world coincide with what you're doing? And again, we can say these things because this is public knowledge. The integrated review has been published, so we know that there's a government view equally from the US on China, India, etc.
So the I believe it's the IEA, the International Energy Agency, when I was working with them more closely, had a workshop, and it's a bit obvious what the outcome was, but they surveyed their member countries. It was quite interesting to note that...
Is the IEA a UN agency? Or
no, it's a separate entity. And I remember speaking to, I think it was Fatih Birol, who heads up the IEA, when I was working for Minister Kwasi Kwarteng at the time, and I remember him saying that when they think of climate change, they don't think about the kind of like nice stuff, like, it's good for the environment. They actually see climate change as beneficial for energy security. And that was the case which I heard about 4 years ago. And now we see more so with wider geopolitics that actually climate change is not only like a nice to have, weather-wise, etc., and for the animals and so forth, but actually has much more wider, broader security implications. So I feel internationally with geopolitics, energy security has gone much more to the forefront, which has helped somewhat to drive climate change up the agenda a lot more in policy making. The only problem is to avoid kind of brown sliding, where we had all these pledges 4 years ago, and now that we have like cases.
Brown sliding, is that the term when you?
That's the time we use. So
Okay.
the green shift and brown sliding is like backsliding, but going brownwards.
Wow.
So we had the green shift, but we just didn't avoid the brown sliding. So for instance, we've seen with the impact of like Russian invasion of Ukraine, how that spiked energy level, like that spiked energy prices in the continent and if not wider, and it's even been a prior case where a lot of countries have been thinking with their energy sources, how can they securitize it, along with other more natural resources. But that's the thing with geopolitics and climate change, where there's a much more of a security angle and lens to it now.
Yeah, well, I mean, anything that persuades countries to think more greener, broadly, I'm for it. If you switch gears a little bit now to
the night job.
the night job, yeah. So a couple of night jobs.
Yeah.
Your departmental race network, and then the cross government
one.
race forum. I don't even know where to begin, but maybe start with the race forum first, because that feels wider. But you want to say something?
I think it would be. Let's start from the inverse, and let's talk about staff networks. The staff networks are like informal voluntary organisations at a workplace which get together based on like a common identity or kind of passion or interest area, and
or protected
characteristic, yeah. And so many organisations have like women's network, LGBT network, race network, and so forth. In government, so what has happened traditionally, we've had very, I would like to say, immature networks where just form together and they do the kind of very basic bread and butter kind of organisation and just doing the key events like Black History Month, whatever. And what happened at Bayes was that we had the opportunity that we had the right individuals who saw that the network was inefficient at departmental level and there was no coordination with other departments. So we operated in a fog. And so what we decided first to do was to reshift the whole governance framework, how we are operated, and have like a much more logical framework in how do we make a change in the workplace. And it was quite well timed because we had passionate individuals who saw the state of the department. So this was a department which had ethnic minorities and parity to the general population only up until...
In terms of like their grade?
In terms of grading. Yeah. So I'm trying to de-civil service it. So only up to, let's say there's 4 bandings and there will be only in the top of the C band, so bottom second tier, which is SEO grade, and a lot of negative experiences in people survey scores, things like bullying, harassment, discrimination, racism picking up and so forth. So that was our situation of the land, and the race network could be an amazing vehicle for that. So we were lucky in that regards that we had talented individuals who were around at the time, before I joined, who saw the need to rescope it. And we had, luckily, on the very top, the Cabinet Secretary, who's the Prime Minister's equivalent. He recognised that minorities and disabled colleagues had the worst experiences in government based on the whole civil service-wide issue. And our Permanent Secretary, who's like a Secretary of State equivalent, saw this as well and wanted to reshift diverse inclusion in the workplace. So we had the kind of top-down vision and buy-in, and then we had the bottom recognition that here's the challenge. And so what happened with the department is that we focused on developing a race action plan, and that focused on recruitment and retention, management, leadership, as well as the environment which you work in. And so we were really successful in the past, let's say 3 years, even in between the pandemic delaying things, in increasing recruitment and retention staff, so that we went from parity at SEO grade to grade 6. And even now, I just looked at the latest figures, we're very close to having the senior civil servants in our department at near ethnic minority parity to general population. When you compare that rate of change in the past 5 years, when we first started the race action plan, to historically, that amount of change was not seen since 10 years prior. And then before that, we all know like it wasn't a very diverse workplace. So that's the kind of like window dressing side really good.
You must be proud of that of that shift.
Yeah. So I can't claim the stuff per se, but it's like we helped to work with HR to drive that. But I'm happy to see that we have a lot more diversity in the workplace, and we also included within that sprint targets for black senior civil servants to drive the change. So it's been, I think someone has spotted that the department's on its forms, 178 years of history, has never had a black male senior civil servant.
And by senior civil servant, you mean a director general or a perm sec or
Deputy director upwards.
deputy director upwards? Okay, yeah.
So that's we're just talking about from the very kind of the whole senior civil servant
Across the whole civil service,
executive.
no black man had been
in the
a
executive
senior civil servant.
Yeah, so not
SCS.
Yeah, so that's the executive branch of civil service.
Yeah,
And within 2 years we got 9.
amazing.
So it says a lot. So that's the window dressing side.
So, how did you do that? How did you convert a plan into outcomes, into deliverable, measurable, demonstrable stuff? Because I've seen it in the NHS, lots of workforce race equality plans, race action plans, don't always translate into more senior black and ethnic minorities at that grade. So what do you think it was about your situation that led to that?
I think we were lucky that a lot of things got aligned. We had the top level buy-in. We had the kind of talent at the kind of network to drive and monitor things. That's the kind of nitty-gritty.
The competency and capabilities.
Yeah. So I mentioned race action plan because it's very smart, specific, measurable, actionable, results-based, and time-orientated. So we had those kind of very specific 4 areas which we want to work on and which we can measure. And then we also had the wider environment where at that time when it was coming to force, we were talking about Black Lives Matter, George Floyd. So the zeitgeist of civil service race equity was really high. So we were quite lucky in having all 3 of those aligned together, which enabled that much amount of change in a short period of time. So that's what I would say are the 3 main things.
Yeah, so I have such a wry smile because, as you might know, I was chair of the NHS England BAME staff network, and I've got to be careful what I say here.
Yeah.
But we didn't have all of those things that you mentioned. We had some of those things.
Yeah.
And yeah, it feels, looking back, it feels like a bit of a missed opportunity to not have, done that. So for people watching this now who don't have the global phenomenon of, the height of the apex of BLM, who may not have the senior level buy-in, what would be your advice to try and get the ingredients to make that change happen?
Yeah, so I think there's 2 things which have dramatically changed from dealing with right now in terms of staff networks. And we get to managing civil service race forum a bit later. But I've seen in department that 2 things have been massive changes. One is hybrid working. There's pros and cons. So initially when we had hybrid events, everyone really switched on, engaged, and tuned into like diversity inclusion. And now it's a case where if it's not in person, it's much harder to engage with people. So you can disseminate information, that's fine, to a wider audience, but you won't get the same level of engagement and activism like you had being in person all the time. And that has its own dynamics. And the second thing is prioritization for staff time to engage in
voluntary staff
time to engage in diversity inclusion. And I use the word diversity inclusion because that's what it is. But the problem is that when we talk about having voluntary time, which even if it's not accounted for, so some organizations have mandatory in your performance plans, you can have corporate objectives. We no longer do that anymore. Diversity inclusion always takes the bottom consideration when work picks up. But I like to call it corporate. You got people's pressure in the day job, especially in civil service with the overworked perma crisis, and is also in their personal lives how they're managing the cost of living crisis, which is hanging over their heads, which means that when it comes to doing good in the workforce and wider, that's taken an even less of a priority because they have less capacity to do so. So those 2 main things. I would say in response to that, we were quite lucky that we had all 3 elements there
at that time.
Now you got to understand what is most relevant for people now. And in our organisation, it's training and capability building, being a forum and platform to scrutinise the HR policies and senior leaders, and also providing people a kind of space to engage and to kind of share ideas. Those are 3 main things I'll say I will focus on to make an effective change in an organisation.
So recognising the context you're in and shifting, for want of a better word, like the targets to manage that a bit better. Because I definitely feel you on that capacity thing. So, when I moved from NHS England to the Department of Health, I, really active as chair of the BAME staff network for NHSE. But I really dialed down a lot of those activism and stuff just because, it was really hard and thinking actually I'm giving up a lot of time for this thing which I don't think is right because a lot of the ingredients weren't there for me. And it feels like it's the expense of my career and the other things I'm working
100%,
on.
100%.
So that was hard. And so a question to you now is, you are still co-chair of the race.
For another 2 more weeks, I'm looking to hand over because,
Okay.
for most staff network organisations, it's healthy to. We're quite lucky that despite all the challenges, we're still quite an active network. But when it comes to leadership, you have to kind of empower your committee to develop and grow. So I'm quite happy to say that in the past 1 or 2 years, everyone has gone for promotion, if not double, and if they haven't gone for promotion internally, have moved outside to a much higher paid, higher ranked job. So
Wow.
so they went from HCOs, SEOs.
You've got some sauce, mate.
Yeah, to like senior consultants or managers at Big Four consulting firms, for instance.
Nice.
And we had people who go from SEO grade 7 to grade 6 based on the kind of competencies they developed in the FAME network, which allow them to kind of build the confidence to go for much more high position roles. So that's when it comes to why I need to step aside, because you have to have that pipeline.
Yeah. Amazing. And so magnanimous, if you excuse me, and like logical and all the rest of it to think like that. Do you get weathered? Do you, and if not, why? And if so, how do you manage it?
Very much so. I feel like you mentioned voluntary time. So initially, when it comes to like staff networks, it's usually 10-20% many organisations, and it's usually organise a bake fair, send an email about
Pride Month or something,
or like inclusive language for like managing meetings, which is important, but it definitely takes more than 10% like of my time. Like I spend weekends trying to like formulate this initially when it came to voice action plan and meeting with senior leaders and so forth. But I feel like it's a personal sacrifice you take to your health and your kind of mental well-being. But there's nothing more rewarding where, for instance, you sit in dispute panels for ethnic minorities who are put on performance improvement plans, which we found out through our race action plan as one metric, including the performance management. Not a single white person, when we had the race action plan, was put on performance improvement plans. They were all ethnic minorities, which is a way of fast-track people to get fired.
Yeah, so same in the NHS. So I sat on nursing tribunals, and the disproportionate number of English not being the first language of ethnic minority people, particularly nursing and medicine doctors, was disproportionate. But being a voice on there, being able to advocate
and defending them is worth it, because when you get a thank you that you were the advocate, because a lot of them may not have been signed up to their union, so they wouldn't have been entitled to a PCS, which is our union rep, being there to support them in their cases. And so even if they weren't all successful, at least they had the kind of moral kind of backing from us that we were there to defend them, make the case for them, change the wider policies so that we were questioning why is it that when you have performance improvement plans, why are they all ethnic minorities, and really make the most of the cases, in fact nearly all cases, the white line managers on the other side question why did he put this person on a performance improvement plan, and you want to get rid of them when the civil service is traditionally very well known as being a place that was very hard to get rid of someone once they pass probation. So those kind of things where you really turn people's lives around, and like I'm quite fortunate how I'm as a person, but when you see these individuals who are really struggling because this is their bread and butter in real terms, and for them to lose a job and to go out in the job market is completely inconceivable.
Yeah. So it feels like seeing the green shoots, positive things happening, motivated you continue to...
Well, I think it's defending those who can't necessarily find the voice to advocate for them, which motivates me, which pushes me to read their dispute panels and so forth. But even wider things where I've seen the environment change and how ethnic minorities are much more confident in the workplace. Like I've seen in the past 5 years, like I made the case about the grade divisions. Like there's a lot more diversity in the workplace, and especially more in other office sites where people are a lot more friendly. You can feel it in the air. So that's something which I do feel happy for.
Amazing. We're nearly out of time, but and there's so much we could have spoken about with the climate health work, race forum, but broadly, what's what's next for you? If you can say, if you feel confident enough to say, is it to get some more of the reforms that you're working on in the policy side, to expand the network, or what you're handing over, and to make sure that succession goes well? Or?
So I think the main thing is for succession to go well when the department splits. So many organisations have to manage with maintaining momentum. I feel like we had a mixed result with that, but we're still alive. Like many staff networks across many organisations have just collapsed if they were barely around. I feel like with the Civil Service Race Forum, which looks across wider government, I'm still in my kind of tenure for that. The main thing is to standardise that kind of practice across. So I mentioned department first, because once we had the case where we made effective changes in how we looked and how we operated, and that in turn will affect the policies we make to the wider public. Once we have that fixed,
more representative.
More representative, yeah. and there's a lot more considerations. So I mentioned climate change, my day job. One key important, just transition and public sector quality duty. By having that kind of awareness that you can relate more to people from different racial backgrounds and different cultural heritage, and understanding that makes you more aware that these are humans as well with lived experiences. What I wanted to do is make sure that other race networks are much more developed and confident. So one thing I did is that I worked with Radius Leadership, which is like a training facility, and I secured over 100k worth in free training to develop the leadership capabilities and strategy skills of 138 leaders in government who are network chairs or in the committees. And so I want to see that training go through. So they should finish by June, the first batch,
amazing,
and the second batch should be August, September. That's one thing which I want to see through, like has that training been effective for them? And I mentioned free because I had to secure that, because if it wasn't free, then you have to make an individual case to do L&D, and if it's not part of your day job, then you're not going to get it. That's one thing which I want to see through. But the second thing is having the kind of drive for race equity to still go through it and be really strategic in its approach. So I mentioned things like recruitment, retention, performance. Those are really important, and making sure every department can do that, but also the departmental and arm's body networks are in a position where they can react to major issues. So if there are any cases like racism, bullying, harassment, discrimination, they're in a position where they can react very effectively. And that's one thing which you probably see in the news, a lot of allegations and so forth. I want the race networks to be confident with the HR teams to react and reassure staff accordingly.
Yeah. I might get a little bit personal on this last question, but if I remember correctly, and I might be making it up now, so correct me if I'm wrong.
No worries.
When in your A levels, did you say that you struggled a little bit with doing politics or getting a good result there? Am I misremembering a conversation a long time ago? Or?
No. So I enjoyed it in politics.
Yeah.
The thing was that it was the year which it was the last year for doing £3,000 a year for university.
Okay.
So it was mega competitive. So I just missed that by one grade.
Okay.
To get in the course I wanted to do. But I think like
all right.
Well, there's ways the world works.
Yeah. No, because the thing I wanted to get to was you. Not appear to you understand the language of convincing, particularly seniors in civil service, and making effective logical arguments, persuasive business cases to secure the 100k for L&D of FMC leaders, etc. And I think not a lot of other people may have that language, that understanding of how to do that. So just be interesting if you were to give anyone advice that was younger and early in their career, seeing you and seeing what you've been able to do effectively. How do they get to that position? Was it just studying hard? Was it reading around a lot? Was it joining networks and societies like the Fabians? Or?
Yeah. So you and I know each other from Fabian networks. I felt as if my best strength was understanding how do you build a team around you. So you can only do so much on yourself, and I'll admit I'm not exceptional in a lot of skills, but I just got 7 8 in many skills. But
just doubling down on those, is it then? Or?
Well, it's about acknowledging that, but also realising there are people who are exceptional in certain elements, and they could be deficient in other elements, and how do you support them to work on the weaknesses and really enhance their strengths, and how can that support you in what you want to do and having a collective vision. So I've always been good at team building, so that's one trait I had. And to team build, you need to network and understand who are good people to have around you as allies in your in your life. When it comes to then later in the workplace, I realize it's important too, because when you look at senior leadership, unfortunately there is a case of failing upwards, but there's also a case of going upwards together, where in an organisation there's only so much you can do. Let's focus on the race element. If you're the only black person on the C-suite on the board, there's not much you can do. But if you can build up the others across the whole pipeline, then you can make an effective change in an organisation. That's one thing which I'd say younger people to consider. But think about your networks and who you surround yourself with and who you develop. Looking back, I know it's very easy to hero worship and look at like leaders, etc., like the race champions, like who have OBEs and knighthoods and so forth. Inspiration that is, I feel like the most important thing is to look at the environment you're in and focus on localized change and what you can affect and make a change and learn from those lessons and then build upwards.
It's really good advice. We're out of time, but I'm definitely going to take your advice and cling onto your coattails as you as you rise up the civil service. Don't forget me and take me wherever you go to affect politics that affects the country. But we'll leave it there for now. Junaed, thank you so much for your time.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Cheers.
Thanks.